PSU and the money that perhaps is stuck because Russia continues to face sanctions, and the sanctions is not allowing money that a lot of PSUs had invested in Russia to come back, to get it back. Krishnakumar joining us in the studios at this point. Krishna, please do walk in. We're not talking about 1 million, 2 million. We're talking about $600 million worth of dividend money that a lot of PSUs are hoping to get back from Russia, are not able to do so. And they were hoping that in lieu of that money, perhaps some oil can come in.
Right. And that all of this is happening because of all the isolation that has happened with Russia, Shweta. To put it simply, the money that's stuck over there, it's difficult for Indian oil companies, and bear in mind, Indian oil companies, have money worth $600 million in the form of dividends, which means their investments in Russia, run into multiple billions of dollars, where they've taken up stakes in Russian oil fields and Russian refineries and Russian companies. That includes Indian companies like ONGC Videsh and a couple of others. Now, that dividend money that they've gotten from the investments, they're not able to get it back because Russia is cut off from the international banking system. Bear in mind, in February 2022, the SWIFT, or Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, or SWIFT, which essentially links banks across the world and across countries for cross-border transactions. Russia was thrown out of SWIFT in February 2022. About 7 Russian banks and then more banks were added, which basically meant that taking money from Russia and moving it to any part of the world was absolutely impossible, because Russian banks were cut off. And India right now, and post that, what has India been doing? India has been buying tons of Russian oil, and mainly because it comes at a discounted rate because of all the sanctions elsewhere. So India has made tons of money. Indian companies with their investments have made lots of money, and that's where you find the situation. The banks are cut off, and you have lots of money. How do you move it back? So Indian companies oil companies essentially are looking at 2 options. One is to buy the oil, and the other is to lend to people who are buying Russian oil, and they can repay that lent money here in India. So these 2 are the options that oil companies in India are exploring to bring back that $600+ million that's stuck in Russia.
And come to think of it, $150 million is stuck for Oil India only. So that's one company that has a majority share of that money that is currently stuck in Russia. And when we say stuck in Russia, a lot of people perhaps it's difficult to explain it to a lot of people, but this money cannot be brought back. This money cannot be brought back because there are sanctions in India, in Russia, that do not allow this money to be sent offshore to India. And so therefore the possible explanations that many of these companies are giving as to how to get it back. So one is a definite way of doing it, which is we're going to buy oil and you keep the money, we buy the oil, or we give this money to somebody who is buying the oil, and that's how we settle the trade. But they're also exploring legal options, is what we're hearing.
Yeah, they are exploring legal options, but they are quite a while away at this stage, because right now the situation is a problem of practicality. What do you do when you are not when the money that's lying in a bunch of banks is not connected, not just to you, but to the rest of the world? Bear in mind, Russian banks are now isolated from the rest of the world. So how do you take that money, in what currency, in what value, how will you transfer it when the bank in itself is not in the system? Russian banks are not going to show up in the SWIFT system that cuts across a dozen countries and more than 200 banks. And the artery of the global financial system. I cannot impress upon the importance of SWIFT, which is Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, which is a bit of an acronym. It's called SWIFT, and SWIFT links banks across the world. And when the money that we have is stuck in a particular country where all the banks are cut off from the rest of the world, it becomes hugely problematic for India. And legal options, yes, but I'm not the legal expert over here as to what they can do to get this money back. But I think Indian oil companies are being smart about it, saying that we will explore legal options. That's a horizon into the future. But in the meanwhile, we can look at explore other options with which we can get the money back onto Indian shores faster.
And I have to, perhaps for our viewers who are watching us right now, why is this conversation important? Because we continue to be one of the largest importers of Russian oil post-sanctions. India and Russia and their trade ties have seen a new high post the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and that is on account of the oil relationship. India, which is a net importer of crude oil, find a new partner through which it could get discounted oil, and hence the relationship between the two countries strengthened all the way more. But this is a new problem that perhaps many people could not have thought of about 6 months or 8 months ago.
Right, because when we saw those headlines, in February 2022, being Russian banks being cut off, most of us would have thought, okay, that's Russia's problem. If Russian banks are cut off from international financial systems, it's Russia's problem. What do we have to do over here? But that is the reason why it comes very unexpected. But the fact of the matter is that Indian companies like ONGC, Videsh have been having stakes in Russian oil fields and refineries for a while. ONGC Videsh, for example, has $5.5 billion worth of stakes in a couple of Russian oil fields. That's kind of money that's been already pumped in by Indian oil companies in the oil sector of Russia. So it was always going to be a matter of time before we get those returns. And so far, all the dividends and all these things had no issue because there was no Ukraine war. And now you have Ukraine war, and it gets complicated by the fact that
because it's also unabated. Earlier there were indications perhaps 1 year later the war will be over, the conflict will be over. The longer it goes, the more it prolongs, the more difficult it gets for oil companies to get their dividend back into India.
In February, when when Russian banks were thrown out of the SWIFT system, nobody thought we'd be having this conversation in September 2023 that we're not able to get our money back. We'd have thought February to February. Okay, May, June, we're in September right now, and there's no signs of the war abating or Russia getting back into the global financial system. And time is money, Shweta. How much money can we allow to be stuck in Russia for how long?
Absolutely.